Good morning, everybody. We're very fortunate to be joined today by Dominic Buscall of Wild Ken Hill. He'll be taking us through his experiences of management of traditionally farmed land alongside a habitat managed estate. He will take us through for about 20 minutes or so, and my colleague Sarah Pateman will then provide a couple of top tips in respect of buffer land. Over to Dominic now.
Thank you, Andrea, and Milton Reeve team, and all of you who've joined us this morning. I really appreciate it because we're doing some interesting things at Ken Hill, Wild Ken Hill. But you know, we really care about not only collaborating with other land managers, but also what's going on with land management in the UK in terms of food security and climate change and nature recovery. So grateful for the opportunity to chat, and I'll talk for probably 15-20 minutes, just sharing some of our experiences on this subject, and then I know there's a bit of time for Q&A. Great, I'll get stuck in. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dominic Buscall. I'm the co-owner and manager at Wild Ken Hill. I had a short career in consulting for about 5 years, and in 2019 I returned to basically the family farm, and we started what we call Wild Ken Hill, which is really a land management project, but increasingly includes a lot of advocacy and engagement with people. Ken Hill is around 4,000 acres. It's on the west coast of Norfolk, and I'll come back to this, but quite a heterogeneous site in terms of soils and habitats. And therefore our business and increasingly how we manage land is quite different from part to part. Now, what I want to specifically talk about today is habitat management, and in particular habitat management agreements. And the way that I'm going to try to do that is by sort of comparing and contrasting with some of the other land uses that we have experience with at Wild Ken Hill. And I'm going to specifically talk about these land uses when applied to marginal land. Now, one thing I want to be really clear about is that, especially the land managers on this webinar, we all manage extremely different pieces of land, extremely different soils. And so what I'm saying here is by no means trying to proselytize for anything that we do. I'm going to talk about our worst, least productive farmland and how we've experimented with different land uses there, and how that's been contractually and financially for us. But that may not be appropriate for your farm or your soils. And so I wanted to be clear about that. Now at Wild Ken Hill, I suppose for context, across the whole farm, our historical winter wheat yield would be about 7.3. And that includes all of the better soils, so not especially strong, and that average was brought down a lot by the marginal farmland that we do have, which was around 550 acres, of which you can see a picture there, which it's not going to give you everything you need to see, but you can see a little as to how sandy and light it is, and we had real problems with blackgrass, and indeed you might be able to glimpse the wash in the background, so you can kind of see where we are sort of geographically. Now, on that marginal farmland, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've practiced 3 different types of land use: conventional arable farming, which many of you will be familiar with, what I would call a public environmental payment, such as high-level stewardship or countryside stewardship, and now we have sort of dipped our toe, I suppose, in the nascent markets of what I would call private environmental payments, and specifically in this case, biodiversity net gain. So I'm going to treat each of those land uses as separate and individual, and I'm going to just run through a few dimensions of comparison for those, in the hope that I can draw out some insights for you today. So just put together this little table where I try to sort of compare them, and I'm going to go column by column. So I won't spend long on conventional arable farming because I'm almost certainly less qualified to talk about it than the other land managers. on this webinar. But we had pretty conventional West Norfolk rotation. We're talking wheat, barley, oilseed, rape, sugar beets. Principal output is food. We're retailing it to multiple private customers. So we did have a diversified customer base, all private, and contractually, obviously, this is a mixture of crop pre-sales, especially when we're locking in prices against our known fixed costs, or alternatively selling on the open market. And I guess it goes without saying that the delivery and therefore the financial risk in this sits with you, the land manager, when you're doing this, and we'll come back to why that's interesting. And obviously we still farm, plenty of land at Kenhill, and we farm for 5 other farms locally as well. But in terms of performing a conventional system on marginal land, we did that up until 2019, and we've actually stopped doing that now. We're employing other land uses, or we're performing a regenerative system instead. So that's us on conventional arable farming. Moving into the different types of environmental payments. So many of you will be the same, but we've had a lot of experience both previously and currently in different higher tier schemes. And at the moment, we're in a pretty significant countryside stewardship scheme, including around 500 acres of creation of woodland pasture on the same marginal land. And this time we are effectively providing a single biodiversity output, but it is known, of course, that alongside that we'll also be sequestering quite a lot of carbon, maybe preventing nutrients entering our watercourses, and some other products which in time we might be able to sell separately, and stacking and bundling is sort of being worked on. We're selling to a single public customer, our government, and in terms of agreement, as you know, these are typically 5 to 10 year agreements between the RPA and ourselves. The payment rates, although I know they've been jumping up a bit recently, which we welcome, are typically fixed at the beginning of that period. They're not typically inflation linked. And we all know how prescriptive they are, and I suppose the risks of not getting your areas right or following your prescription. And so, with that in mind, the delivery risk is very much, again, with the land manager. Now, I suppose this starts to get more interesting. And so, bearing in mind those kind of more classical and widely adopted land uses, let's think about the newer types of payments coming along in private environmental markets. So, there are a number of these, and we also doing a bit in carbon, and we've tried looking at biodiversity credits. But I specifically want to talk about biodiversity net gain, which is a legal component of the Environment Act, which is applied in the planning process, effectively to allow developers to offset and implement a net gain of biodiversity for any biodiversity that they impact negatively when they develop. Now, when you enter this market, you are providing a biodiversity product. It is labeled as a biodiversity product. It is only a biodiversity product, but there are known co-benefits to these, which my understanding at the moment is it's with most of the net gain deals going on, those extra benefits are non-retailable separately, but that they are known to be occurring. In this instance, we're dealing with a single counterparty, private company. They're called the Environment Bank, and we recently signed a 30-year deal with them. Now, the legal structure that you engage with the counterparty is different to both the prior. Effectively, we've signed 2 separate but linked agreements with the counterparty. Firstly, in the area in question, they are leasing that from us under an FBT. And then secondly, they contract back the management of that land to us. They do not have a national land management operation. They ask us, the land manager, to come back and do that for them. And this is an important nuance because they've leased the land from you in order to create biodiversity credit. And they then ask you to go and create those credits for them. And you co-create what is called a habitat management plan, which is used by a lot of conservation organisations to say what you're going to do in that habitat. And they lead that, but you get to input for sure. You then go about doing it for them, but you are not responsible if those methods and processes that you've been asked to do not result in the biodiversity uplift that is expected. The counterparty is on the hook for delivering that. They are the ones selling the credit onwards to developers and potentially to LPAs. Does that make sense? So we get contracted to do the doing. So actually, in terms of the doing, there's a lot less risk with us. And if something does go wrong, and the outcomes can be quite they're highly specific actually. For example, they'll be asking us to generate specific number of species of plant, in sampled plots over time. So let's say we didn't achieve the 10 or whatever number of species that we were required to per plot. They would need to come back to us, and we would need to redevelop the management plan to encourage it. But there is no financial risk for us there. We would just keep being asked to do different things until it worked. So those are the sort of what briefly one final thing is obviously with a 30-year agreement, the inflation risk is a lot more, but it is unlike government schemes, and it is negotiable. There are inflation links to the payment rate. So that's a sort of overview of how the contractual arrangements differ. And well, I'll come back and do a bit of a summary, but I did want to touch briefly on financing arrangements too. So again, the numbers that I'm talking about here are gross margin figures, actual gross margin figures on the marginal land that I am referring to at Wild Ken Hill. So when we were performing a conventional arable farming operation on this land, you see, we were collecting BPS, and in fact, in all of these situations, you can continue to collect BPS. And so I'm just going to put that to one side for a minute because it's the same in each scenario. I'm just going to compare the other components. And our cropping gross margin during that period was £375 per hectare. So you get a sense of how we were struggling. And actually, when we were doing that, our fixed cost began with a 5. So we were effectively losing money without BPS to farm that land. We had a bit of countryside stewardship there, our classic margins and headlands. So there's a bit of extra gross margin came in at that moment in time too. Now, when we moved some of that area into countryside stewardship, we were able to secure under the stewardship a series of options which basically added up to £550 a hectare for 10 years, and actually those rates have gone up since. That was what we initially agreed rather than the increase. So a slight premium to what we were doing under conventional arable farming, and obviously quite a lot more steady and consistent. Now, it's an interesting time in this private environmental market because they are nascent, and I'll come back to this, but I think that means there are opportunities to achieve premiums at the moment because it's not too commoditized and prices aren't sort of I suppose too well settled. So that for us is quite a big premium over what we were achieving before. The counterparty typically will invest any required capex, and actually there aren't really any direct costs. We have to obviously use some of our fixed costs to deliver this, but not any direct costs. So actually the gross margin or the income is basically all gross margin, as it were. So you can see how if you're interested in this sort of deal, it can be quite financially attractive. So I just wanted to wrap up hopefully the insights from that brief comparison. So firstly, private environmental payments do offer quite an interesting diversification opportunity for land managers. You're dealing with different customers and different products, and we know that diversification is a good idea to have a resilient business. So I think that's a positive. Certainly at the moment, particularly on marginal land where maybe your arable or other farming income is not particularly high, you can achieve quite good premiums and actually add value to your bottom line. The agreements are less prescriptive. You sign a habitat management agreement, as I said, and in that you're basically saying, I will deliver the habitat management plan. But the habitat management plan is co-created, it's a dynamic document, it can be updated, so it's less prescriptive, but it is very, very outcome focused. The stewardship applications are notoriously not outcome focused, you're just following prescription. But these private environmental markets, they tend to be very outcome focused. And if those outcomes are not achieved, there is a delivery risk for your counterparty. Now, the contractual arrangements, you can probably tell, they are different, they can be unfamiliar. And in our experience, they were, maybe because of that unfamiliarity, they were more complex and they took longer to agree and to sign off. And we were able to do so probably only with the help of Mills and Reeve. So that is something to be aware of. But I do feel our team have benefited greatly from that learning experience of engaging with all of this documentation and legal frameworks. Now, one of the principles of both carbon and biodiversity sort of offsetting or credit is that you need to achieve permanence, or at least guarantee that what you're delivering will last the lifetime of, let's say, the development. So the contract lengths are likely to be significantly longer, and 30 years is sort of actually pretty average. They could be for 50 or even 100 sometimes. And that can be a bit off-putting and scary for land managers who like to have flexibility. And of course, there is a risk for us, I suppose, that in that 30-year period, the counterparty doesn't perform well or survive, and that is something you have to acknowledge and understand how you might react to if it does happen. I think finally, and of course, many of you will know that Treasury issued a new consultation around some of this work recently. There is still some uncertainty about how this sort of thing will be treated under IHT, whether it will benefit from agricultural property relief. I was at a meeting last week where some policy advisors were pretty certain that it is going to be, but nonetheless, the Treasury is currently performing a consultation seeking to understand from the market what uncertainty still exists, and I'm pretty sure this will come up, but hopefully it will be settled quite soon. And I think in conclusion, there are some obviously quite attractive elements to introducing habitat management agreements with private customers alongside your existing operation, but there are some challenges on legal that you do need to think through and come to a decision as to whether it's appropriate for you on your holding or on your system. And I think I would always say that we have to be land manager led. That's me, really. A quick plug for us. We have a great bit of social media, and we do a newsletter, and we always love to welcome other land managers and professionals in the sector to Ken Hill. So do get in touch for any of those. And thank you. I will now hand back to the lovely folks at Mills and Reeve.
Dom, thank you very much. Just gonna, hopefully everybody can see my screen sharing. So Dom, thank you. And hi to everybody. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Sarah Pateman. I'm a solicitor at Mills and Reeve in the Agri team, and I'm based out of the Cambridge office. So my focus is just for the next 5 minutes is to highlight a couple of practical legal points in the situation where you as a landowner or a land manager want to let some of your land out on a farm business tenancy, FBT, to a third party, and that FBT land is adjacent to your habitat area. You might think that entering into an FBT is quite simple, but with the emerging details of legislation, the regulations and new schemes, it's becoming more complex for both landlords and tenants to navigate. So it is wise to start looking at some of those finer details in FBTs, especially if you want to protect your habitat area. So the first of my couple of legal points is to do with boundaries. So as a reminder, my scenario is on my slide, you've got your habitat area on the left with the trees and the water droplet and the acorn. And then you've got the FBT land on the right with the tractor and the crops. And the dashed line down the middle represents the boundary. Why boundaries? because boundaries like your hedges, your ditches, your watercourses, and that scrawny shelter belt of trees that you never know what to do with, they are a rich haven for carbon sequestration and for wildlife. And of course, they may have the potential to attract a financial gain. So who's going to have control over that boundary? For example, with hedges, normally it's considered the tenant's responsibility, or you cut one side and I'll cut the other side. But should the relationship be like that? Where do you need the boundary to be? Perhaps you need to manage both sides of the hedge because you have a special species there that you want to protect, or you're under a scheme. Perhaps you need a buffer zone to protect your habitat area and boundary from sprays or applications being used on the FBT land. The main point is understand what you need and make sure the FBT reflects it. Don't just rely on your template. Now, although not strictly linked to boundaries, but often they are overlooked, are the shelter belts and those small areas of woodland. Historically, these areas offered little or no financial gain to a landlord, and so would be lumped in with the rest of the FBT. But could they potentially be strategic areas for future schemes? And if so, you'll need rights as a landlord to access them, and those rights need to be adequate for your purposes. The main thing is don't forget to reserve them. Moving on to my second point, the user and management clauses in the FBT, often known as tenants' covenants. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the form and content in FBT, the user and management clauses are often lengthy and often get bundled into a schedule at the back. But if you're looking to protect your habitat area, you should probably take a closer look at the field schedule. This most commonly appears at Schedule 1 of the FBT. And as a solicitor, I'm often given just an area of hectares or acres to state in this section, and that lengthy table of fields and areas is often avoided. But consider, would it help to stipulate what field is what? For example, do you want that grass margin to stay where it is? Do you want that nice temporary grassland area that you intend to put into the FBT area to remain as it is, because actually it acts as a really good wildlife corridor through the FBT to your habitat area? How about the clause where the tenant must farm in accordance with the rules of good husbandry? Is that way of farming compatible with your land use elsewhere? And is it of a standard that you want? It might be better to think about how you want the FBT land to be returned to you so you can set the standard at the start of the FBT. You might also want to check the genetically modified, or perhaps this might now become the gene editing clause. Traditionally, GM crops have been prohibited in FBTs or can only be grown with landlord's consent. Presumably, you would want it to stay that way. But this is ultimately going to depend on your views and what you want to achieve on your land. And sewage sludge, do you want to consent to this should the tenant ask? Could the use of this actually impact on your habitat area next door, or your watercourse that you're trying to protect, or your nutrient neutrality scheme, for example? You might also want to consider insurance, shooting rights, indemnities, possibly end of tenancy compensation. The list goes on, but that's where I'm going to stop for today. In light of what I have spoken about, if you want to review your standard forms of FBTs, or you've got a particular letting in mind that you want to discuss, I or other members of the team will be more than happy to assist you with that. I will say that the points that I have highlighted may, of course, have a knock-on effect to other things. So, for example, imposing a buffer zone on a tenant in an arable field could arguably attract a lower rent. But if that tenant enters that buffer zone into its own scheme, it could be worth something, so the tenant might pay more. But who knows? It's a bit of a balancing act. But as far as the legal aspects are concerned, I or the team can help you reach that balance that's best for you. Now, I'm going to hand you back to Andrew now, who will be taking any questions that you have in relation to this morning's webinar. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Dominic. The questions are already lining up, as you'd expect with such an interesting topic. And I'm going to launch into one for Dominic of my own, actually. You talked about being required to plant in a slightly different way in your private environmental scheme, and so there might be multiple plants that are your crops that are going in. What type of planting are we talking about specifically?
Yes, well, that will depend upon the habitat types that you have agreed to deliver. In our case, we are delivering mostly species-rich grassland, some scrub and some woodland, and a few ponds. There's no planting for ponds. Now, so a bit different planting for each of those. The species-rich grassland we're effectively going to take green hay from elsewhere on the site where we have species-rich grassland, and distribute that. So no planting, but sort of an indirect sowing method. And the scrub and the woodland, those both species, both sets of species for those which we pre-agreed with the counterparty, are planted in the sort of traditional manner. And all of those capital expenditures are paid for by the third party, and we deliver them internally, basically. So that's the planting that's required. And then there are moments in time through the agreement where the counterparty's ecologist will come and measure how we are doing. And as I said, if versus the stated kind of metrics and KPIs, we are not where we need to be, then we would need to work with them to change the management approach to get where we need to be.
Thank you. I think considering woodland more than scrub, you're effectively committing yourself beyond the lifespan of the agreement, depending on tree type and suitability for forestry. One of the questions that we have from our participants today is whether you essentially bound in after the 30-year arrangement, or whether you can return to arable use. So is it a case that it depends on exactly what you've committed to, or are you free to essentially undo everything that you've committed to?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that the woodland you wouldn't be able to. By then it would have been, I'm sure the Forestry Commission would have come along and said, well, that's woodland and therefore you can't take it out. In our case, the woodland is minuscule. It's maybe 1 or 2% of the overall area, just a bit of a strip down the side. Scrub, I have to admit to not be so sure about, but I guess that could be the same. But again, for us, it's a small part of the scheme. I think the interesting one will be the species which grassland, which is the majority of the area. Now, I suppose in theory, ceteris paribus, no changes in the law. At the end of the lease, you have that land back. It's unlikely to be designated, I would think, but it could be. And I suppose you could do what you want. I think you then enter a bit of a moral question about what's the right thing to do. And who knows what sorts of schemes and incentives will be available to you at the end of the 30 years to then maintain that area or improve it further. But it's quite possible that there would be.
Thank you for that. We've got some specific questions around costs, and I'll put two together to allow you to answer them more fully. We have a question around the cost of fencing and whether that was a cost to the estate or to the environmental scheme. Then there's a question around £900 and whether that's rent too, effectively.
Yes. So let me try to take these in turn. So the question around the rent, I think, is referencing a specific sort of a specific part of this arrangement, which is that obviously we've signed two separate legal agreements with the counterparty. One effectively is their lease deal, and one is then the management contract. And so when I displayed that figure for the total gross margin for the site, it actually is comprised of two components: a rental payment and a management payment, if that makes sense. And so those are separate, but I was adding those up to make the total figure. So there's not a management payment on top of that. So I think our view is that the 30-year deal, the management cost or the management fee we receive, we'll probably end up spending most of that or attributing it to our fixed cost base to get it going. But I think we think that after maybe 5 or 10 years, actually the amount of management you have to do to maintain the biodiverse site that you've created be quite low. and our net margin should probably, our profitability of it should go up, and particularly by the end, we think you could probably make really quite strong margins on that. It'd be just all we probably need to be doing is a bit of deer stalking, and maybe some we'd be rotating grazing onto it every so often, and we graze other sites nearby, so that should be really quite easy. I think there was a question around fencing and other capital expenditure. My understanding is that would be paid for. Some examples, some electric fencing, I think we're going to have included. There's no water supply down there for livestock, so I think we've reached an agreement around that as well. And I think, if you think about it like this, at the end of the day, these credits are going to be exceptionally valuable to the third party. I think they take a pretty collaborative approach to ensuring that you have what you need to deliver the credit, because it's very much in their financial interest. So a Bowser, supply water or whatever, that's not big fry to those guys. And then I think there was a question there about values, and it's a really interesting one to which I don't have the answer. I'm certainly not a land agent. I suppose in theory, the land value is going to be in part driven by the IHT status, which I said would be uncertain. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And by the way, we haven't had any valuations done like pre and post, so I don't have like hard data. But I suppose the other driver of it will be the yield on the land, and we're going to be achieving a higher yield. So that could increase it. We could also, fall foul of some IHT changes, and it could go down. Again, we haven't had the valuations done, and frankly, it's all a bit of a theoretical exercise anyway, as I'm sure many of you would appreciate.
Okay, we have a question around the views of banks and lenders, and I'm not sure that that's one that we're actually able to to answer.
Spare me that one, please, Andrea. That was really
I don't
hard.
think we'd necessarily know the answer to that one. So if anonymous attendee would like to email me separately, I will have a quick conversation with banking lawyer colleagues as a mere property lawyer and see what the word is out there in the market about a view on this. But we are genuinely at very early stages, state of flux, and the biodiversity net gain legislation is going to change in the autumn, or as in we're going to have the detail of the legislation that we know is coming. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of what we're doing at Mills and Reeve is helping to people to navigate uncertainty, which brings us back to kind of Sarah's approach of we're looking at your usual lettings. Do we need to consider making changes that don't necessarily make sense now, but mean that we're on the front foot in 2 years or 3 years, when early adopters such as Wild Ken Hill have kind of proven the case for the arrangements with habitat and management, and it becomes much more commonplace and in a steady regulatory framework, which then just means everybody has an idea of what they're dealing with and what the benefits are in matters such as the costs, such as the income differential, and such as values, where at the moment I don't know that we are able really to pinpoint with any certainty what the information is. And similarly, there's a question about triple SIs such as stone curlews, and I think that really brings us back to our topic of about 3 weeks ago, when we were looking at the possibility of bundling together environmental benefits and how that might look as everything evolves in the coming years. I don't know if you've got any particular experience with corridors of that nature, Dominic. No,
I'm afraid I don't. But my suspicion is that it would probably be more difficult. Yeah, you'd obviously have to comply with all of the triple SI regs, and I also have heard recently that because the triple SI is one of the number of designated sites, because it is designated, it is theoretically should be protected and conserved already for biodiversity by law, and therefore to go and try and attract a payment to go and deliver biodiversity is inappropriate. You wouldn't be providing what they tend to call additionality. And I actually haven't looked into that myself, but it would make sense to me.
Brilliant. I think that might be it isn't the last of our questions. We've got some extra ones. Thank you, everybody. We've got a very interesting question about process here. So how long did it take to set up the BNG arrangement? So that is really from initial discussions with, in your case, the Environment Bank, there's others out there, to then enter into the agreement that's then many years long.
I think it took, well, I think once we, the funny thing was, obviously we had quite a few scoping calls, but I think once we had basically agreed had the terms, it still took another 5 months after that, which I think speaks to the unfamiliarity of what we were doing, not only for us, but also for the counterparty. But if you think about the fact that this marketplace is, I think it's probably just over a year old, you know, because it was only introduced and mandated by the Environment Act. Actually, even for this counterparty, who I think are by far and away the leading intermediary of these things, of these credits, even for them, it was quite unfamiliar. So they're doing deals around the country, but they are learning a lot along the way. And of course, they're not, you know, they're a new entity. I think they're really good. Actually, I've got a lot of respect for the team there, but they don't have a background in land management and FBTs and all of this sort of stuff. So I think they were learning quite a lot, and that is probably why it took quite a long time. Time well spent. You know, we take our liability seriously, so it was good to do it that way.
And we've been asked a question around accepting commercial risk. I think that the commercial risk will be different for every owner or manager that's out there. You know, it's a difficult one on how you measure what is an acceptable commercial risk for you in these arrangements. I think the main one that you mentioned, Dominic, was the concern that the promised income wasn't going to be there after 10 years, 15 years. I think that's the obvious one for most everybody. Are there any others that you could highlight?
Not particularly. I think that is the main risk. Effectively, you know, they've attracted £200 million investment, so they're not small fry, but they are a startup, and so effectively you've signed a long deal with a startup, and you know they are your customer, and yeah, that poses some risks, and they are privately backed and owned, so in theory there could be change of ownership, and that was probably what we thought was maybe a more likely risk. And you know, suddenly, you know, we really like the counterparty, but if suddenly you were dealing with a really sharky version, that might be a bit scarier. So that for me is probably the risk. But what I quite like about it, and why I think it's diversified, is that you know, when you read these habitat management plans, and it says, oh, you must deliver like 15 species of plant, and you must have no non-natives and blah blah blah. That's quite scary. But at the end of the day, it's not on us; it's on them. And if we don't achieve that, as I said, they have to go away, work out how they're going to deal with it, and then ask us to do it. And that, I suppose, that could even necessitate changes to the management fee.
Absolutely. I mean, the output risk is so significant, and there's so many factors out there. So just having that removed from you is the big upside, and it's the one that everybody will need to weigh the pros and cons of individually. You know, my huge thanks to Dominic and also to Sarah for sharing their knowledge and experience with us today. Goodbye all.